Thank you for joining us today on behalf of the Municipal Climate Change Action Center, Pembina Institute, and Business Renewable Center Canada for today's presentation on our research investigating and advocating for community renewable energy in Alberta through the power of aggregation. My name is Ryan Patel. I'm a program manager here at Alberta Municipalities, and alongside a great team, I work on programs, services, and projects that are offered through the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. For today, I guess I'll be your host. I think like most folks on the call, I'm very excited to hear from our guests, and I'll introduce them as we progress through their presentation. As we get started, I wanted to respectfully acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional and ancestral territory of many Indigenous, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. We recognize that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many people that are presently subject to treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, as well as the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Today, I'm in the city of Edmonton, which is located on Treaty 6 territory. We respect the courageous and resilient community leadership of Indigenous peoples of all ages, knowledge keepers, and elders, those who are still with us today, as well as those that have gone before us. And we make this acknowledgement as a small act of reconciliation, gratitude, and commitment to pursuing an inclusive, collaborative, and respectful path forward in building strong communities. Looking through the attendee list, it's great to see some familiar names. Welcome back to one of our sessions here. There's lots of new names as well. So for those that aren't familiar with the Municipal Climate Change Action Center, just wanted to reiterate that is a collaboration between the 2 municipal associations in the province. That's Alberta Municipalities, as well as Rural Municipalities of Alberta. And the third partner is the Government of Alberta. And our center was founded in 2009 to deliver education and capacity building supports to municipalities and community-led organizations through a variety of programs. So the agenda for today, we'll start the presentation with our special guests, Jan Pepper and Clayton Stafford, who will share details about their individual involvements, as well as their expertise with community renewable energy and aggregation. I'm really grateful to have both of them here today, and we'll look to ask each of them questions after their short presentations. So again, please feel free to use that question and answer box. From there, I'll introduce Ben Thibault, who is the lead author for the Enabling Community Renewable Energy Development through Aggregation Research Project. And Ben will lead us through a presentation summarizing in the paper, and then we'll end the whole presentation with another question period as time permits. So before going to Jan, a little bit about her. Jan Pepper has over 30 years of energy and utility experience with a focus on renewable energy contracting and financing. She joined Peninsula Clean Energy as CEO in May 2016 as the first employee. As CEO, Jan leads the organization to deliver 100% renewable energy on a 24/7 basis by 2050 and transition transportation and building energy use away from fossil fuels to clean energy. Peninsula Clean Energy is the community choice aggregation agency for San Mateo County and the city of Los Baños. Peninsula Clean Energy has 2 investment grade credit ratings and has saved its customers over $90 million since inception by delivering cleaner and greener electricity at a 5% discount to all of its customers. Jan was elected to the Los Altos City Council in 2012 and served as mayor in 2015 and 2020. I ended up in a bit of a deep dive this morning on Wikipedia about Los Altos. So I wanted to say go Eagles, which I understand is the local varsity team. Doing a bit of procrastinating, I guess, on my end in preparation for the talk. Kidding aside, I think this lens of being on city council and serving as elected official gives Jan a great lens on community-led projects. Jan also has a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering, as well as an MBA, both from Stanford University, and is a registered professional engineer in California. Jan has worked formally at Silicon Valley Power and has also founded 4 energy-related startups. So thank you, Jan, for being here today. I'm going to pass it over to you to lead us through the conversation.
Thank you, Ronak, for a very gracious introduction. Actually, my children went to the competing school, which were the Spartans, the Mountain View Spartans, but that's okay. So appreciate you unless you lived here, you wouldn't know how the school districts are set up. They don't follow the city lines. But anyways, thank you to everyone who has come today for these presentations and for your interest. It's my pleasure to have been invited to share with you what we're doing here in California and how we're aggregating communities to provide renewable energy to them. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I will talk today about what CCAs are, Community Choice Aggregation, what we are as an organization, Peninsula Clean Energy, how it works, the impact on our communities, our strategic goals, one of our special strategic goals, and then actually some of our aggregation programs for solar and storage and the energy programs that we are offering to our customers. So first, some history about what community choice aggregation is. Back in the late 90s, California restructured its electricity industry to decouple transmission, distribution, and generation services. And it started out fine. It ran into problems, and then it was kind of shut down in the early 2000s. And back in 2002, a bill was passed in the California legislature, AB 117, which allowed communities to aggregate their electric load. So a city, a county, or a city plus county could aggregate their electric load and decide what they wanted the source of their electricity to be. It's an opt-out program, meaning that once a community decides that they want to aggregate their electrical load, everyone in that community is automatically enrolled in the program. If they don't want to be a part of it, they can opt out and go back to the investor-owned utility, which in our case is Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E. So the first community choice energy program that was established was in Marin County, and that was in 2010. And we were the 5th CCA that was formed in 2016. And now there are 24 CCAs throughout the state of California. And if we go to the next slide, the map on the left shows the service territories of the 3 big investor-owned utilities. The dark blue area is PG&E, the green area is Southern California Edison, and then at the very bottom left is San Diego Gas and Electric. And then you can see in the map on the right where the CCAs have formed thus far in the state. It's mostly along the coast, which is where the majority of the population lives, but we're also trying to move more into the Central Valley as well. And if we go to the next slide, this shows a map of where we are, San Mateo County. We're the county just south of San Francisco, and we serve the electric load for all residential and business customers in the county of San Mateo and all of the 20 cities and towns in that county. And we also serve the city of Los Banos, which is that little dot more in the Central Valley, which is in Merced County. And our overall annual electric load is about 3,700 gigawatt hours. 97% of our customers have stayed with us, so only 3% have opted out to go back to PG&E. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we're called what's called a joint powers authority, which is a legal structure that allows the cities to form this agency. We have a 23-member board of directors who I report to, so I have 23 bosses, and they consist of a council member from every city, town, 2 of the county supervisors in San Mateo, plus a council member from the city of Los Banos. And right now we have about 40 members on our staff. And as I noted, all residents and businesses are automatically enrolled to receive electricity generation services from PCE once that city decides to move forward. And as noted, we have 2 investment grade credit ratings, one from Moody's and one from Fitch. So the next slide shows how it works. So if we think about how electricity gets to people, there's the generation of the electricity, there's the delivery over the poles and wires, and then there's the customer who is able to turn on their lights and use electricity. So we are the generation provider. We purchase electricity for our customers from renewable and clean sources right now. We put that energy onto the electric grid, and then it is delivered by PG&E over their poles and wires. They also send the bill to the customer, and we have a line item on the bill for our generation services. And the cost that they used to incur from PG&E is no longer on the bill. And since we started, we have offered a 5% discount to our customers below what the PG&E rate was that they would have incurred. And if we go to the next slide, because of this, since we started in 2016, our customers have saved over $107 million by having the lower rates from Peninsula Clean Energy, as well as a superior product. It's cleaner and greener. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, our customers have saved, or emissions savings have been 1.2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent avoided from the electricity generation compared to what it was in 2016, which is equivalent to 141 million gallons of gasoline use. So that's our vision, and our mission is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we're doing that. Our strategic plan, which we adopted in 2020, has two specific organizational priorities. One is to deliver 100% renewable energy each and every hour of the day by 2025, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And then also help our member communities use that clean electricity to reduce GHG emissions in buildings and transportation by 2035. So moving to electric transportation, use of electricity in their buildings to reduce the emissions from what is currently being used, which is fossil fuels and gasoline in cars, and natural gas for heating our homes and heating our water and cooking. So our current, if we go to the next slide, their first step is to decarbonize the grid. And our mix right now of electricity is 50% renewable, consisting of solar, wind, small hydro, and geothermal projects. And then the other 50% is from large hydro projects to give us a total mix of 100% clean electricity. Our plan is to transition out that large hydro and replace that with all renewable energy by 2025, and also to match it on a 24/7 basis, so we are not sending any demand signals to fossil fuel plants to be providing electricity during those hours of the day when the renewables aren't generating, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So as we look at achieving renewable energy by 24/7 by 2025, we recently published a white paper on this, which is on our website, peninsulacleanenergy.com, and it talks about the model that we built to achieve this and what resource mix we're going to have, and what the plan is over time to do that. And I'll give you a quick summary right now. So if we look at our emissions footprint right now, as I noted, we have solar, we have wind, we have geothermal, we have small hydro. So in the summertime here in California and most places in the world, the sun is shining brightly during the summer. The wind blows typically in the evening and throughout the night. But when we look at the course of the year, things are different. So this is a heat map, and it goes from January 1 through December 31 along the horizontal axis. So those are the 365 days of the year that are demonstrated on the bottom, and then the 24 hours of the day from midnight through noon through midnight. So basically there's 8,760 pixels here to represent the 8,760 hours of the day. And the color scale where it's all green, that's great. That's where there's no greenhouse gas emissions being generated, but we can see in the winter time and in the night that the emissions are higher because the solar is not generating during that time. We are instead relying on the grid, relying on natural gas-fired power plants here in California to deliver electricity during that time. But when we account for this in our reporting, we're creating excess renewables in the summertime, and we're kind of getting credit for those in the wintertime. So overall, we can say that we are putting onto the grid 100% clean electricity to meet the annual demand of our customers throughout the year. But when we look on an hour-by-hour basis, it's a little bit different. So the first step is to look at our portfolio. So the black along the vertical axis here is the hours of the day, and on the The vertical axis is the megawatts of demand, and the black line that curves along here is our electric load. Thank you. And so, in the night and early morning, it's low. In the morning, when people get up, it starts to increase. In the evening, it peaks when people come home to make their dinners and relax, and then it goes back down in the evening. And then we need to fill up that area under the line to meet the load of our customers. Right now, what we do, we have some geothermal, which is the red band along the bottom. That's pretty much a base load resource that generates the same amount every hour of every day. There's a thin line there for the small hydro, which are smaller projects, but again, they're pretty consistent. The dark blue is the wind, and the general wind pattern that we see here is that it dies down in the middle of the afternoon. It picks up as the sun is going down, and then it's strong during the night. And then you can see the solar, which is the yellow. It picks up, of course, when the sun comes up in the morning, and it drops off in the evening. And you can see that we have excess solar during the part of the day that we're creating more electricity than our demand is. And so we kind of get credited with that when we look at the number of renewable energy credits we have received. But those gray areas in the evening and in the morning are where we're relying on the grid, which is typically natural gas-based electricity. So if we go to the next slide, our plan is to store that excess solar energy that's produced during the middle of the afternoon. And so those green hatched lines are where we are charging storage devices. And then the solid green area is where we are discharging that solar. So by following this pattern, we will be able to provide renewable energy every hour of every day by just kind of shifting when that solar power is delivered to our customers, and then thereby not relying on the fossil-based grid energy. And then the last step that we're going to do is in the next slide, which is a little farther off, try to shape and shift our load on the demand side. So the dotted line is the original load. The solid black line would be the new load that we're trying to aim for, and to encourage the use of, for example, electric vehicle charging in the afternoon when the solar is abundant, as opposed to people plugging in their cars when they get home in the evening, and other types of things to shape and shift our load, and thereby further reducing the impact on the grid. And then the result, which is shown on the next slide, when we look at the heat map, by doing these things, we're able to turn this more all green, and all green is good. And there's just less areas where we have some emissions. And again, it's mostly in the evenings, nighttime and early morning in the wintertime, when there's less solar production, and therefore it's more difficult to be able to store enough solar to meet that overnight load. So that's our goal. And we're planning to, what we've adopted is that we'll do 100% renewable energy and match on an hourly basis 99% of the time. Where the cost to go to 100% is about 10% more, but the results of our research show that we would be able to achieve this at about the same cost as we're doing now, mainly because renewables are less expensive. Once you lock in the price for renewables, for a solar project, for a wind project, you know exactly what you're going to be paying for that. And as opposed to being reliant on fossil-based resources like natural gas, where it's subject to the volatility of world markets, and you never know if it's going to be up or down. Right now, it's way up. And so we will be better able to control our costs by having all renewables. A couple other things that we're doing that might be of interest to you. So one of the projects that we're doing is aggregating a number of municipal sites in our service area to install solar plus energy storage on those public buildings. So in this first round of projects, we reached out to all of our member agencies to identify those buildings that they might be interested in putting solar on. We did site assessments of those, and we aggregated all those together. We have hired a contractor to install those solar systems on those buildings, and we will be owning those systems on all of those roofs, and we'll be providing a power purchase agreement, which is called a PPA here. I'm sorry for using the acronym, to sell the electricity from those solar systems to the municipal agencies. And what this allows is that they have zero upfront expenditure for this. We're just going to put the solar on, we will own it, we'll sell them the electricity, and we're able to do it at a lower rate than the low rate that we're already offering them, because we're able to aggregate a number of sites and get some economies of scale by putting in all of these projects. So this first round, we have 12 municipal sites of approximately 2 megawatts total of solar and 2 kilowatts of energy storage. And we're now collecting interest from more sites, other municipalities, school districts, other public agencies. And we will probably have about 60 sites that we're going to aggregate for our second round here. So we're really excited to be able to do that for our customers. And then the next item I wanted to just touch on was how we partner with our member communities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're using that clean electricity that we generate to electrify transportation and to electrify buildings. And I'm happy to go into more detail on that if you're interested, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure there's time for all of your questions. So that's what I have to share with you today. We go to the last slide, our vision is a sustainable world with clean energy for everyone. And here's my contact information. I'd be happy to follow up with anyone who has questions about what we're doing or how we might be able to help you in your efforts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate hearing about a project that is somewhere different than Alberta. There's a lot of ideas and contexts that as we look across jurisdictions, it's important to consider so we don't narrow our focus too much. So I'm going to take a look over in the Q&A, but maybe I'll just caveat this by saying there's like 100+ people on the webinar. There won't be time to get to all the questions. We'll try our best to combine questions as they make sense to do so. I appreciate that you've shared your info. I'll encourage anyone to follow up if you do have a question that's pertinent to any of the speakers or to myself directly. All right, so a question here about what is used for the storage. The question specifically is about storage on rooftops, but I think we could welcome an answer about what storage technologies are being used.
Yes, right now we're using lithium-ion storage because that's the most economical and the most available. We're hoping that in the future there will be other types of less environmentally difficult types of storage that has less of an environmental impact.
Yeah, for sure. As I was just going to say, as that space continues to evolve, I'm sure the options that exist for storage will increase. There's a question about, I guess, long-term plans. So ramping up from round 1, it seems like your round 2 project has a lot of candidate sites in mind. Do you have a longer-term plan for round 3 or otherwise?
For the solar plus storage on the public buildings, yes. I mean, we're trying to get this first set in before April 14th. We're trying to get the interconnection applications in there. I see there's a question here about NEM 3.0. So there's a change in the way California is going to be compensating behind the meter rooftop solar projects. The compensation is going to be less once NEM 3.0 takes place. The way the rules are written, any application that's submitted before April 15th can be under the old NEM 2.0 rules. So So the way the billing works out, we are the generation provider. And so when someone gets their bill, there's generation services and there's also transmission and distribution services. They still get billed for that from PG&E, and PG&E is the distribution utility. They're the ones responsible for maintaining the grid and doing all the upgrades that are needed as more electrification happens. And so under NEM 3.0, the reimbursement rate will be lower on the T&D side. We control what we offer for the compensation on the generation side. And currently we offer a higher rate than PG&E does. We offer actually our retail rate for our 100% renewable project. And we're in the midst of starting to discuss that internally as to whether we would continue to maintain that level of reimbursement for the generation portion of the selling back to the grid, as it were. My sense is that we will definitely be more than what PG&E was, and that we will, I don't know if we'll maintain the higher rate, but we'll make a recommendation to our board and see what they decide to do.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of complexity in that, I can imagine. Questions are certainly flying. I'm going to try and shotgun a bunch into one big question. So feel free to take this in what direction you'd like. But maybe you could comment on some of the specifics on generation. Are there cost comparisons between the solar, the wind, the geothermal, the hydro? Are there other options for storage? Someone asked about, I think pumped hydro. Yeah, and maybe to throw something else in there, another soft curveball. Any comments on resiliency of the grid in California? Okay.
Yeah, so when we look at the costs of the different renewables, solar is the least expensive right now, and then wind, geothermal is a little more expensive because it is base load and it's there all the time. The small hydro is kind of in between. They're very small projects, so they're a very small part of our overall load. And then on the storage side, right now, when we put out requests for offers to get proposals for new projects, what we're seeing come in are all lithium-ion projects. So we are hoping that over the next few years, we'll start to see other types of technologies that are less environmentally bad. We have also joined up with a bunch of other CCAs to form another joint purchasing entity for larger projects. So we have most of our storage project at utility scale are 4-hour batteries, but we have a requirement in California for some long duration storage. The Public Utilities Commission has told us we need to have X number of megawatts of long duration storage. So we teamed up with other CCAs and have contracted for a portion of an 8-hour long duration storage project, again, using lithium-ion batteries. We're hoping to see other technologies like flow batteries. There's a compressed air energy storage project that we're looking at. In terms of pumped storage, there isn't a lot of that available. There are a couple of large projects that the investor-owned utilities own, and we really don't have access to those. So those would be great, but right now we don't see a lot of options for being able to contract for that. Mm-hmm. Let's see, and the other question was about the grid, the resiliency of the grid. Mm-hmm. And the grid, we're just the generation provider. We do not maintain the grid. PG&E maintains the grid. You maybe have heard of PG&E. They're sometimes in the news. Often usually not good news about them. So it's their responsibility to upgrade the grid. We work with them closely because we do need to partner with them. And, they're spending a lot of time on wildfires and trying to harden the grid so that when a fire starts, it doesn't impact the grid. They sometimes do turn off the grid if there's a fire and it's going to, there's some safety concerns about other fires being generated from I guess it's usually if there's really high winds and the grid is their grid is possibly going to ignite a fire, they'll turn it off. So we will all be in the dark for a few hours while that's going on. So there's a lot of work going on there. But the distribution system just right here in the neighborhoods also needs to be upgraded. And our sense is that over time, as there is more electrification, as there are more electric vehicles added, that PG&E will be upgrading the distribution system to handle that increased load. But everyone's not going to get an EV tomorrow, so there's not going to be a huge spike in that demand. It's going to be gradual, and hopefully they'll be able to keep up with that. But, you know, if you do, I mean, one thing that we're interested in, sorry to give such a long answer, is just an individual's resiliency. So if you have an electric vehicle, there's work going on right now to be able to use that EV as a backup for your home. And hopefully that technology is going to be available really soon, so that when there are power outages, and if someone has an EV, they can have that dual purpose of both being transportation and also resiliency for your own home or business or wherever.
Yeah, it's really just a battery on four wheels. Well, thanks for hitting all three of those questions. There's a lot more coming into. I can appreciate that the crowd's really engaged, but just to keep us moving, I'm gonna just reiterate that, you know, if you do have a burning question, please feel free to follow up. Jan provided her email. I'm sure she's willing to talk to you if you want to learn more. But thank you, Jan. Really appreciate your time on this.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for everyone's interest.
All right, so we're going to shift over to our next guest, who is Clayton Stafford. A little bit about Clayton. So Clayton is a senior partner at Green Planet Energy Analytics, where he is responsible for overall business management and client project delivery. Clayton also plays an active role in client engagement, particularly at the strategic planning, project planning, and initiation stages. His focus is on enabling smart people to do good work, supporting them as required, and getting out of the way when appropriate. Clayton is also a project manager for Three Nations Energy, working closely with the board of directors and other key community contacts in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. This is to help oversee and manage clean energy projects in the community, such as the Three Nations Energy Solar Farm, or 3NE Solar Farm, Canada's largest remote community solar farm. Clayton has been leading the delivery of enterprise-class technology solutions for over 30 years. He's worked as a consulting practice manager, management consultant, and project manager, both as an independent consultant and with multinational consulting firms, serving clients in a variety of sectors, including telecommunications, energy, utilities, banking, education, health, and provincial government. He's also managed technology startups focused on enterprising application integration and distributed data storage systems. Clayton is a professional engineer and holds a master's in electrical engineering from University of Alberta and a BSc in electrical engineering from the University of Calgary. Maybe to just go quickly back to my varsity joke, I'll be curious to know if you are supporting the Dinos or the Golden Bears, Clayton. But yeah, appreciate your time here. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
All right, yeah, I won't. I don't take sides.
Good answer.
All right, yeah, thanks for the intro. Looking at that, I can see I need to update my bio. I think the years and counting now. Yeah, Green Planet Energy Analytics works with mostly with First Nations and municipal clients on a range of renewable energy, energy efficiency, green building projects, from small to some fairly large scale solar and storage projects as well. And on this particular project that I'm going to be talking about today, we were in the role of project managers for or on behalf of Three Nations Energy through construction into operations of the Fort Chipewyan solar farm, and you know, we were also involved in helping to create Three Nations Energy as a corporate entity in the community for this project. Next slide. All right, and what I'm going to high level, what I'm going to go over today is really it's talking about a case study in community generation in Alberta. I'll talk about the background, a bit of background on the project, the community partnership behind the project. And I'll also talk a bit about how we worked with ATCO, our utility partner, in this project. And then I'll close with just some observations, thoughts, learnings of operating as a community generator, a small scale generation regulation in Alberta. Three Nations Energy, and this facility was the first community generator approved under that current regulations. Next slide. And probably skip quickly through the next slide because it's and there's a bit of a delay of the slides showing up on my screen, so I might have a little lag and get ahead of things. But from perspective, it's worth understanding where Fort Chipewyan is. It's in the northeast corner of Alberta, on the shores of Lake Athabasca, and at the confluence of the Peace and Athabasca river systems. And the Peace Athabasca Delta is the largest inland river delta in North America. The other interesting feature up there is that it's on the southeast, Fort Chip's on the southeast corner of Wood Buffalo National Park. So that's the community we're talking about today. Next slide. And so we started this project, putting this project together in 2018. At that time, and what was the state of power generation in Fort Chip? I mean, Fort Chip was and remains an isolated grid, so it's not connected to the overall Alberta grid. There's a distribution network within the community that's operated by ATCO Electric, and power in the community is provided by, or at that time was provided by ATCO's Third Lake generating station, where there are 4 diesel gensets that churn through more than 3 million liters of diesel per year to provide power to the community. And at the time we started this, ATCO was at a point where their storage capacity for diesel was running up against point where of not being able to provide all of the power that the community needed because of load growth in the community. So next slide. And I guess the next slide speaks to why storage was an issue for diesel. Fort Chip is accessible by road for only a few weeks per year. Generally, the winter road to heavy truck traffic from late January, early February to the middle of March. So there's basically a few weeks of the year where everything that has to come in by truck needs to get in there. So the ATCO needs at their Third Lake plant to store enough fuel to power the community for the whole year. So that was a challenge. They either needed to add storage or options for meeting some of the power requirement in the community. And I'll give ATCO credit for being a catalyst to making this project happen. Next slide. And this, so what does the power generation in Fort Chip look like today? The station is still there, still operating. The solar farm that you see in the picture here, the small piece on the left side is we call phase 1. That's a 600 kilowatt solar farm owned and operated by ATCO. Phase 2 is the Three Nations Energy solar farm, which is 2.35 megawatts. And then to make all of this stuff work together, at the time we were implementing phase 2, also put in a 1.5 megawatt hour battery and microgrid control systems, basically to allow the renewable energy assets to interoperate cleanly and smoothly with the diesel generation in an in a small grid situation where we have to follow the load. There's no room in the grid to dump excess power in and just hope it goes somewhere. So the control situation is actually a lot of fun and some interesting engineering challenges up there that I won't go into today. Next slide. So at this point, the renewable energy, the two phases of solar in Fort Chip are supplying about 25% of the annual electricity requirement of the community. So that's reduced the amount of diesel that needs to come up by truck on the winter road by about 800,000 liters per year. There's been a corresponding emission reduction connected with that as well. I got some feedback. First year we were operating from the guys that haul the diesel up for ATCO, that they noticed that they had fewer trucks going up on the road that year. Just a quick acknowledgement of our project sponsors. This project was funded by Natural Resources Canada and the government of Alberta, and we can come back to this. There's interest, but I mean it's important to note that in a remote community like Fort Chip, a project like this is not financially viable, without some kind of support. Just your payback on your capital exceeds the life of the assets if part 50% more roughly to build a solar farm there than it does down south. And partly because the sun doesn't shine as much up there as it does in the south either. Okay, next slide. All right, community partnership. We can flip quickly to the next slide as well. So the Three Nations Energy is owned by the Three Nations who live and work and in the Peace Athabasca Delta. So that's the Mikisew Cree First Nation, the Fort Chippewa Métis Nation, and the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. Go to the next slide. Three Nations Energy is an equal partnership of those three nations with a consensus-based decision-making model at the board level. So it's managed by a board with two directors. And it's worth noting that that's not how things were done in Fort Chip before this project happened. The typical model was very competitive and not collaborative. And so there were some skeptics when we started down this path, but it's been demonstrated to work. And the community has looked at what Three Nations Energy is doing and sees it as a model for doing other projects together for the right kind of projects. Go to the next slide. It's not, collaboration isn't necessarily a model for every project. If there's good money to be made, competitive instincts come into play. But for a project that provides a benefit to the community generally and maybe isn't a big money maker, which I think describes this project, it covers its costs and it gives a little back to the community at this point. But doing it together makes more sense. Certainly in the process of securing funding to make the project happen, it was much better to be approaching funders with full representation from all of the nations in the community than it was to be approaching them and trying to go it alone. So there are other similar projects in the community that Three Nations Energy is pursuing. And we see the model having value beyond just this initial renewable energy project. Next slide. Okay, our utility partners, I mentioned, and we can roll through to the next one. I mentioned that ATCO was involved right from the front end of this. they were a bit of a catalyst and very supportive as we went into this project. And we chose to also engage ATCO as a general contractor for construction of the solar farm. And we worked with ATCO through design and construction in an open co-management model where all were open, and we were working together to look for cost savings and efficiencies and to manage issues and risks associated with the project. That worked very well, and we were able to complete this project on schedule and about 20%, despite the fact that we were doing construction in 2020 as COVID craziness was creating additional challenges and issues for us to manage. We had agreements with our funders because we went into this with an objective of delivering the project below budget. We went in with an understanding and an agreement that we could utilize our savings to deploy additional capacity. We had about $1 million left over in our budget when we got sort of our core scope done, and we're able to use that to add another row to the solar farm. We basically added another 150 kilowatts to the solar farm, and so bit of a good news story from that perspective. But we've also, just worth mentioning, that we have contracted ATCO to operate, manage the solar farm. It's tightly integrated with their operations for their plant and all of their monitoring systems, alarms, controls, and everything. Provides visibility of our renewable assets as well as theirs. So it's a pretty low cost, easy way to operate this facility. Okay. I wanted to talk a little, close with a few comments, thoughts on our experience as a community generator in Alberta. So next slide. Community generators in Alberta operate under what's labeled the small scale generation regulation. This regulation was just coming into effect as we were putting the project together. I just included a couple of excerpts here that kind of highlight the intent of small scale generation regulation. First, it enables distribution connected renewable energy. So there's an objective of lowering the barrier, making it easier for small generators to participate. And then the second item highlights the regulation is laying out a mechanism for basically getting paid for the power that's produced, and making that clearer and simpler for a community generator to understand and plan for. From our perspective, over the since 2019, the regulation as it's currently drafted both supports and to a certain extent constrains community generation. So I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides here. So from a support perspective, the regulation, like I mentioned, lowers the barrier. It essentially requires a distribution operator to accept and connect a community generator. They provided it's not that the distribution system is capable of handling the power that's coming into it, and it provides for compensation of the utility operator for the costs of connection. The other area where it provides support is it establishes a clear price and payment mechanism for a community generator. Basically, into the legislation that the community generator receives the hourly Alberta pool price for the electricity that they supply into the grid. And this also applies for an isolated community generator like Three Nations Energy, even though they're not technically part of the larger grid. The pool price is being used to set the price paid. And then the other piece that's been beneficial is the regulation sets up the balancing pool and their team to community generators in the basically the process of getting paid for their power. So folks at the balancing pool helped us set up an account with the electric system operator. They take our meter data and submit it and produce settlement reports, and the money finds its way into Three Nations Energy's bank account once a month. Doesn't need any time and labor from Three Nations Energy staff, other than we do like to look at the settlements and make sure they make sense and they match up with the metering that we have on the systems. But so for support, so it does support a community generator. I'll finish by just talking about how we think it constrains a community generator, particularly in an isolated scenario like Fort Chip. So it effectively, the regulation prevents a community generator from pursuing a power purchase agreement, from seeking a buyer and arranging for sale of their electricity to that buyer. Now, I'd like others to challenge that and push on that, because it's not explicit in the regulation that you have to, that you can't vote for a PPA. The conversation, government of Alberta at the time, because we were in this weird situation of finalizing a request for funding for our project from the province, and they were in the process of finalizing the small scale generation regulation, they fairly firmly told us that the mechanism for payment as described in the community generation regulation was the mechanism we would be using. Had started down the path of negotiating a PPA with ATCO, and backed away from that, and we operate under and get paid under that model as written in the regulation, where we get the pool price. And the challenge with the pool price for us in an isolated remote community is that the pool price, the cost of producing electricity in that community. I mean, we're okay as Three Nations Energy because we had significant government support that basically fully funded the upfront capital cost of the project. So we don't need to get a return on our capital. We just need to cover our operating costs. So that's not how the local utility is compensating power in a remote community. They tally up their costs of production and get compensated through their rate base for that cost. But that same level of compensation for that avoided cost is not available to Three Nations Energy. So when prices are good, like they have been the last little while, if prices go down, then our margins will get fairly thin. So that's kind of the points I wanted to cover in this presentation, and happy to take what questions people want to we have time for, and yeah, also happy to have people forward questions to me. I think I had a slide with contact on it. There it is.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Clayton. I really appreciate the overview, both of the project, but also I think like lessons learned and what you kind of see maybe as a path forward or things to tweak. There are a handful of questions, but you've actually done a really good job of like setting up the question and answering it in your presentation already. So I feel like some of them have been addressed. There was a question about like what rate of costs electricity do people pay in an isolated grid? But you kind of talked about that with the question about isolated communities and then the pool price there. If you want to expand,
and from a consumer perspective, they pay the same rates as anybody else in Alberta.
Right. That's regulated by AUC, I imagine.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. There's a couple questions about more context in Fort Chip. One question is asking about district heating. Is that used or is that considered as an opportunity to provide heating to residents?
We have so it not used today. Are a couple of projects at the concept stage for limited scale district heating, but it's not in place today.
Right, and maybe I'll just clarify, the diesel that was brought in was used in generators to create electricity, not so much for heating. Would that be an okay summary?
Yeah, I mean, certainly diesel is the predominant heating fuel in the community as well. There is no natural gas in the community. There's if you want to heat with propane, you have to have enough propane tanks in your yard to store a year's worth of propane as well.
Yeah,
So
makes sense.
if you want 4 large propane tanks in your yard, you can go that way. Most people heat with diesel.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, and then there's one question. I don't think this is a case for your project, but maybe I'll invite your thoughts on it. And that's the ability of individuals to invest into projects like this and receive a return. With the nations as partners, they're putting the investment. Do you feel like the scale's okay or scales down to individuals who are interested in doing this kind of work?
I mean, in this case, the nations are investing on behalf of their members, which covers 95% of the people in Fort Chip between the three nations. So we never really thought about individuals as direct investors in the project in this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
yeah, in a way, the nations serve as an aggregator for individuals who are interested, not so much in terms of financial investments in this case, but perhaps more value based. But
yeah,
I know that question came. Yeah.
One thing that I would say there is in this case we have revenue above our operating cost, and that revenue can flow back to the nations, but the nations can also make a decision to reinvest that in other initiatives. So we are, Three Nations Energy has 2 strategic initiatives in place. One to develop local food production facilities, the other to develop dual supply business, because there's an interest in returning to more wood heating in the community. So it's easier with 3 parties at the table to make those reinvestment decisions than if you had 500 individuals involved in that process. So from a community development perspective, having the nations represent, I think, is beneficial.
Makes sense. There are a handful more questions, but Clayton, I think for the sake of time, I might kind of put a pin in it there. Again, you've shared your email. I'm sure you're open to receiving questions, and I would encourage people to follow up with you. I just want to thank you again for the overview for both of the project, but also your thoughts on ComGen. And I think actually it'll transition well into our paper.
Great. Yeah, thanks for taking the time to listen to my spiel.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right. So moving along in the presentation, next we're going to be joined by Ben. Ben is the lead author for this research paper, and he's a great researcher and a great writer, but he's an even better presenter. And I haven't left him much time to cover the paper. So for the sake of saving some time, Ben, maybe I'll skip the bio here and just give you the floor.
Awesome. No, that's great. Thanks, Ronak. I've been running through this to see what I could focus in on to make sure that we have some time here. So let me just jump right in and say that to explain the background and genesis for this research and why this topic has been of interest, I wanted to start by just looking at the involvement communities in Alberta have already had in two opposite but potentially complementary sides of the coin of renewable energy procurement, which is the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side of the coin, I'm just going to actually throw back to Ronick really quickly to provide a bit of an overview of the extensive prior work that MCCAC has done with communities around renewable energy self-use and community generation, starting on the next slide. And this will just provide a bit of like an entry point for understanding why there is interest in aggregation and growing opportunities for community and municipal involvement in renewable energy.
Sure, yeah. The main thing I wanted to kind of add to this slide is that this is a picture from a project with the city of St. Albert, 1.1 megawatts up on their rec center in the city there. And this project was funded in part by the Alberta Municipal Solar Program. This program that's administered by the MCCAC has funded approximately 115 projects since 2016. So we know that there's lots of interest from municipalities in doing microgen projects. Funding is currently fully allocated and new applications are not being accepted, but we're really happy with the program's success. It's fully allocated ahead of schedule in both rounds and the interest that we see for microgen. We've done a bit of work ourselves in the community generation space, starting in 2009 with the ComGen capacity building program. Funding here was provided for projects that's focused on feasibility or pre-development of a community generation project through partnerships and tools. So there were three types of projects that were eligible for funding: technical development, partnership development, and then the development of tools and training. We received 42 applications from municipalities or partnerships of municipalities that requested $7.2 million. 12 of them were successful in their application. This program is referred to further in the research paper as well as on mccac.ca if you are curious, but we did this work to sort of help with that capacity building that's needed in this space. After that, we did run the Municipal ComGen Challenge. So this was run in partnership with Alberta Innovates. Alberta municipalities could apply for funding to form a partnership that would work together on installing a community generation facility. So up to $6 million in funding was available with the goal of bringing municipally owned ComGen projects into the mix of Alberta's grid. After 3 rounds of evaluations and progressions, 2 successful projects were funded. The first of which is the Métis Crossing Solar Project, which is a collaboration between the town of Smoky Lake County, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. This project received $3.9 million in investments to develop 4.9 megawatt solar projects located at Métis Crossing on some traditional land. So there's obviously greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits, local economic and community benefits for the partnering communities. M&A, Métis Nation of Alberta, is planning on offsetting their corporate use of electricity with this project. So we're really happy to see this project move forward. My understanding is that it's on schedule to be completed this summer in alignment with a General Assembly for the Métis Nation of Alberta. The second project that was successful in this program was the Municipal District of Tabor receiving $2.1 million for the Renewable project. And this is to develop 2 megawatts of distributed solar across abandoned oil and gas lease sites. So we know that the reclamation of inactive oil and gas wells is a large problem in Alberta, and this is a strategy to deal with that, utilizing that leftover infrastructure to install solar on these old well pads. Included with this project is also the training of 15 oil and gas workers to equip them with long-term jobs, the direct sharing of revenue for site owners, as well as the municipality for the tax portion. And a large piece of it is also the knowledge transfer plan to help support implementation of more projects like this across the province. So that's a quick overview of like our experience in this space. I'll throw it back to Ben. So.
Awesome. It's a good overview of the side of the coin of communities as producers. But the flip side of that is their interest in acting as renewable energy consumers. And so we've seen that Alberta's large cities have undertaken initiatives to purchase renewable energy for their corporate energy needs, going back to Calgary's efforts towards initially powering the C train and then their corporate energy needs with renewable energy certificate purchases from wind facilities. And then more recently, Edmonton's recent competitive procurement with long-term contracts for new wind and solar that is slated to start in 2024. But now these two sides of that coin for community participation in renewable energy, supply and demand, is also key to understanding the boom in corporate renewable energy procurement that is driving Alberta's unprecedented wind and solar growth right now. So I also want to run through what is behind that boom, because it shows us clearly the business case for renewable energy and how the private sector is doing it cost effectively. So for around 3 or 4 years running now, we've seen an unprecedented boom with no subsidies or public support. And what is behind this is private sector procurement of renewable energy using commercial instruments that create win-win dynamics between buyers and sellers. And I'll run through this quickly, but there's more information in the report that Ronix mentioned that we've done together. I'm going to I'll touch on the next slide really briefly, basically just to say that there's competition and deregulation in both the generation and retail components of our system in Alberta on either side of the grid system that's at the center. So for buyers, this means that although they physically use electricity from a fungible pool of electrons in the grid, they can use financial and contracting instruments to purchase electricity from particular suppliers. And so that means that renewable energy can connect to the grid and also has the opportunity to contract directly with users. And I'm not going to explain in depth how the market works for settling on a price, but on the next slide, I'm just going to say quickly that the price that you get through the power pool in Alberta is very unpredictable and volatile over both the short term and the long term. And this is a serious barrier to financing new renewable energy, because if you can't forecast a few years or even a few months, as forecasters in Alberta have proven many times over, you can imagine what this does to the investment prospects for renewable energy that is looking to recover its upfront capital costs from the market over a couple of decades. So this vulnerability to revenue uncertainty is what we call merchant risk. And as is summarized on the next slide, merchant risk is particularly detrimental to renewable energy because their cost is all capital cost risked up front. So the costs of these projects are very sensitive to the developer's cost of capital. And with higher market risks, you can't access low cost debt, and the expected return on equity from investors is higher. So the developer has to build a heavy risk premium into their cost of their capital. And more expensive capital means more expensive projects and ultimately uncompetitive projects. And in a competitive market, that would mean no projects. And this was effectively the lay of the land in the mid-2010s. The pace of new project development was very slow and required exceptionally creative financing arrangements. But this was, and this was equally true at the utility scale as it was for smaller community generation, until and that on the next slide, we saw developers and the large corporate consumers who wanted to buy renewable energy, but they couldn't find it because it wasn't developing, adopted a contractual and financial mechanism to mitigate merchant risk for developers so they can access the low-cost financing that brings their costs down. So this commercial innovation is called a virtual power purchase agreement, or VPPA. And the mechanism uses a pricing approach called a contract for difference, sometimes shortened to CFD, going back to Jan's apologies for acronyms. And how it works is that a buyer contracts directly with a new renewable energy project developer or a seller to buy their environmental attributes like renewable energy certificates, RECs, or offsets. And the buyer guarantees the total price that the renewable energy developer receives per unit of energy produced through what's called a strike price, by paying or receiving the differential between that set strike price and the market price that the energy gets in that volatile and unpredictable energy market. So this dynamic pricing is shown in the yellow and blue on the right side, with the strike price represented by the straight horizontal line, the dotted line there, and the market price fluctuating up and down over time. If the market price is lower than the strike price, like in the blue shaded times, the buyer pays the developer, as you might typically expect. But if the market price is higher, then the developer actually pays the buyer, as we see in the yellow periods. And so by doing this, the buyer takes the merchant risk off the developer's shoulders, de-risking that investment and allowing the developer to access very low cost capital. And because their project is now so low cost, they are able to offer a very low strike price to the buyer. Strike prices that are so low, in fact, that the buyers are actually making money off of many of these contracts, particularly lately because electricity market prices have been so high. So now I've realized that that might sound very counterintuitive to have a seller pay a buyer for a product, but it works for both parties, and you don't have to take my word for it, because the next slide shows that the private sector has clearly spoken. And so particularly since the start of 2021, we've seen a boom in new deals announced for renewable energy in Alberta by corporations. This graphic is made by the Business Renewable Centre Canada, or BRC Canada, which tracks these deals when they are announced and also helps to bring buyers and sellers together and to educate people around this market. And you can find more information about this market on their website. But I want to go through who is seeking renewable energy like this. And the next slide shows that these companies are coming from an ever-growing set of sectors, demonstrating the widening diversity of interest in renewable energy procurement. Some of them are driven by regulatory requirements to reduce their emissions, like through Alberta's industrial carbon price called TIER. Others are driven by environmental, social, and governance, or ESG commitments that they are making to satisfy customers and financial backers. But regardless, they're using the same instrument. The key is that buyers are finding the renewable energy that they need at exceptionally low cost by mitigating the merchant risk for their counterparty renewable energy developer through VPPA with a contract for difference, a CFD, allowing the developers to finance new projects. And that is precisely what has sparked Alberta's current wind and solar boom, as shown on the next slide, where we know that not a single wind project construction in Alberta since 2014 has gone forward without some kind of off-take contract that gives them revenue certainty. So while wind energy has more than doubled in Alberta since 2019, this is entirely thanks to contracts that have removed merchant risk from developers. And on the solar side, on the next slide, there were only 15 megawatts of utility scale solar in place as of the start of 2020. And since then, we have already seen 77 times that much installed, with that same amount again under construction as we speak. Almost all of that has also had corporate offtake deals. And so we know that these offtake deals have been the linchpin of enabling new renewable energy development and making Alberta the national leader in new wind and solar growth. But on the next slide, when we look at the vast majority of these deals, they have involved big corporate buyers for big corporate wind and solar projects. And this graph shows that most deals have been much larger than the scale of projects we call community generation, and also much bigger than most municipalities' consumption. So in other words, this market is predominantly operating at a scale that excludes community participation. The vast majority of deals for wind in gray here have been over 75 megawatts. So that's larger than the size of the city of Calgary or city of Edmonton's corporate consumption alone. And while solar energy is more modular in the sense that it can reach economies of scale at smaller project sizes, even those deals have been mostly over 25 megawatts. And this isn't that surprising, because these really are commercially complex relationships and contractual instruments. So you just can't justify the expense and resources that go into them unless there is enough on the table to kind of divvy up. But because of that fact, the private sector renewable energy procurement market has also introduced some mechanisms to help solve for scale, as shown on the next slide, where we've seen some aggregation of relatively smaller buyer demand to meet the scale necessary for a VPPA offtake deal. So there's been 2 such deals in Alberta where more than one buyer combined to work together for their renewable energy procurement. And we now have also seen something called deal stacking, where developers use multiple totally separate deals to bring together enough demand to finance a large-scale project. So we've seen in Alberta some commercial innovation to solve for the demand side of the scale problem. And that brings us into our next section. So while we have seen interest from communities in participating in renewable energy, as Ronak discussed and I mentioned, including using some aggregation, we haven't yet seen an offtake deal for communities as generators or as buyers. So through aggregation. So we undertook this research work to document the interest of communities in Alberta to participate in this type of work, to get that real world input, and to see what mechanisms might be employed to enable participation by facilitating scale. And so to do that, we undertook to get input from communities through surveys and interviews, and around 30 different communities responded with responses from a wide diversity of sizes and geographic location, mostly from community energy managers or those types of roles in municipalities. They varied widely in terms of their progress in setting and achieving climate action or emissions reduction targets. And most, though, that had a target saw the importance of clean electricity and meeting those targets and rated it as very, very important. And we also had interviews with around a dozen survey respondents in addition. So looking at the barriers to using clean power, cost was cited as the key barrier across all groups, followed by complexity, and then the lack of electricity consumption by the community. So reflecting the lack of scale. And the reference to cost could be a misunderstanding of the economics of the key instruments for buying renewable energy, or of the costs of renewables themselves, suggesting an education gap. Or it could equally be in reference to the transaction costs of actually running the procurement and then negotiating or entering complex commercial relationships, especially when smaller scales of consumption are under discussion. And that squares with the second most commonly cited barrier, which is on the next slide, which is complexity. And there is no disputing the reality that these procurements are complex. It's a reality we simply can't get around. So the question is, knowing that most municipalities see power emissions as very important for their climate action commitments, how can the cost and complexity be mitigated to enable options for addressing power-related emissions, particularly for communities with loads too small to justify those costs and resources? So on the next slide, we gauged communities' interest in aggregation for their power consumption to enable the scale necessary. And indeed, particularly for communities looking to participate in on-site renewable energy development and help support local economies and in buying energy from off-site projects, we found there was interest in an aggregation, but we also found there was a lot of, this was a new concept for a lot of folks, and they just wanted more information about both aggregation, but also about the concept of VPPAs and the opportunity of using VPPAs to procure low-cost renewable energy. So unsurprisingly, one of the key findings of this research was the need for both education and information sharing to foster a stronger understanding of the economic procurement of renewable energy and how VPPAs work. And that was clear from the interviews and the extra color that we heard about decision-making processes within municipalities. And similarly, finally, the last slide in this section shows that the main upshot is that there is interest among communities in this topic, and also, but scale is a significant barrier with some interest in aggregation, but an overall need for further information and education. So the other big tranche of research that we undertook with this project was a scan for other jurisdictions and examples from other nearby sectors where community participation has been enabled, and to overcome the cost and complexity challenges that are worsened by small scale. And we found a few interesting relevant examples. This first one is something of a context-specific example where communities were able to pair their renewable energy participation with other business imperatives the community had or priorities, particularly profitable uses of municipal land, underused municipal land. So we found a small example in Massachusetts where a town tendered for a developer of a small solar project on landfill space, and a long-term PPA with the town was a part of that package deal, getting the town lease revenue, but also locking in solar at a fixed price for the long term. So the deal package engaged a few interests of the town in a way that they were able to build a win-win package for both the town as buyer and landowner and the developer, even though the project was small scale. And that circumstance might not be quite as unique as it seems at first blush, because although it did not include the offtake part of the Massachusetts deal, the Innisfail solar project in Alberta is similar in the sense that it used underused municipal land, which provided the lease revenue to the town, and included a community benefit agreement. So it's a community generation project by the definition of the small scale generation regulation, as Clayton spoke to. The most interesting on-point example of aggregating municipal buyers for renewable energy procurement really comes out of Australia, where the city of Melbourne led 2 rounds of procurements for new wind energy and included over a dozen municipalities and other public institutions as buyers in the first round. And then for the second round, they even brought in the private sector and interested businesses. So Melbourne's a city of 5 million people. So they could have undertaken a procurement on their own. They had the scale sufficient for that. But the aggregation allowed it to expand its impact and gain even greater efficiencies in its procurement, while also sharing some of the procurement and transaction costs with other participants. So we call this an example of an anchor buyer, facilitating the participation of smaller buyers by including them in their process. And perhaps the most analogous example of public institution aggregation in Alberta is the Alberta Schools Consortium that worked with Blue Earth to offtake from Bull Creek Wind, which was an example of moving an existing consortium for null power. The school districts had been entering contracts for just default power from the grid to reduce their volatility and their costs, and they involved it into undertaking renewable deal. So interesting examples that we can look to as examples where, you know, aggregation is possible in this way. And then finally, one option that jumped out from the US is where aggregation has been accomplished through central procurement with something called green tariffs, which are a mechanism deployed in jurisdictions with regulated electricity systems. So like not what Alberta has now, but because those systems don't enable C&I deals by default, you need to have a way for the utility to enable corporate and institutional procurement of renewable energy. And there's a few different models for doing a green tariff, but one is called a subscription model, and it lends itself particularly to aggregation of smaller buyers, because with the subscription model, the utility or a central procurement agency undertakes the procurement of new renewable energy and signs up buyers to pay for the energy, receive the RECs, and then displace the rising cost of electricity from default emitting electricity supply. And around half of all states have one of these, and they're currently being developed in Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan as we speak. And there's some analogies here also to community consumer choice aggregation that Jan spoke to, in terms of having some central procurement and achieving scale through that aggregation. In Nova Scotia, we're seeing that municipalities are especially interested as off-takers because buying renewable energy helps to offset the carbon costs embedded in electricity, which are set to rise, just like they are here. So like I said, the central point of these green tariffs is to deal with these systems of vertically integrated utilities, but the pleasant side effect is that the subscription model offers an aggregation of relatively small buyers. And it's not super dissimilar, to bring it back to the local context again, from Alberta Municipalities Power Plus program, which helps to aggregate demand for cost-effective power supply for municipalities in Alberta through aggregation and central procurement. It's a program that has been successful at helping communities to purchase competitive electricity. And although it hasn't been specific to renewables because it's technology agnostic, it doesn't exclude renewables from competing. So there are lessons to be learned from all of these examples. There's more information about them and about the Power Plus program in the report. But these examples have allowed us to lead into a few thoughts for what could be pursued to enable this community participation in Alberta, grouped into 4 themes. So the first is some education and information to address the perceived challenges that were either misunderstood or arising from a misunderstanding of the VPPA market. So that's why we're doing a bit of a deep dive in this presentation and also in the report on the VPPA market in Alberta. But then the next sensible step would be to build capacity and expertise to help small municipalities and institutions to move forward despite their limited resources and budgets for procurement initiatives. So this imagines a role for a clearinghouse and some capacity building funding for access to expertise, et cetera, to support an initial aggregation cohort. And then the other 2 themes recognize that on the next slide, that they kind of understand that aggregation can seem like a magic solution to help buyers get together to avoid duplicating their transaction costs, but it doesn't just occur spontaneously in the wild, because aggregation has its own transaction costs and collective action barriers that prevent it from just happening on its own. So the third theme is what we saw from the Melbourne experience, where publicly minded anchor buyers like large municipalities, provinces, or the federal government can leverage their own procurements to bring in more buyers. And we've actually seen procurements from each of those levels of government in the last 5 years in Alberta. And that anchor role hasn't been taken up, but the Melbourne example provides a very positive model to consider for any future procurements that any level of government is looking at doing. And it's really worth considering because, of course, you can amplify your impact and share some of the transaction costs. And then finally, maybe the most kind of ambitious option is to enable a central procurement authority to act as an aggregator by standing that authority up and perhaps securing some kind of capacity building funding to support this authority in its early stages and to pilot an aggregation until it can self-sustain. And as we've noted, we've seen in Alberta with the School Board Consortium and the Power Plus program that this is really possible. So we have models for how it can be done, and I think some just capacity building funding from some level of government that could be devoted to covering the cost of aggregation to enable this could really help to launch an initial effort. And if that effort both aggregates community buyer demand while also seeking supply from community generation projects, then you could really capture both of those benefits with one stone, and we could manage to resolve for scale on both the demand and the supply side of communities' interest in participating in renewable energy development. So that's a very quick version with the report offering kind of a more lengthy deep dive, but a really quick version. I'll throw it back to you, Ronak, to navigate us through whatever time we have left for any further discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I appreciate your ability to wrap up, a 45-page report in 25 minutes. Again, we'll point everyone to the report. It does flush out all of this in a detailed manner. I think for the sake of time, we'll maybe just take one question. It's the most recent one in the queue. And I don't know if you'll need more context, Ben, but the question asks, how does the federal tax incentive for renewable electricity, which requires demonstrated reduced costs for consumers, apply in Alberta's electricity markets?
Yeah, so essentially, the way that this really works is that the ITC allows the renewable energy developer to further reduce their capital cost. So they'll end up with even lower capital cost, reducing what we call their levelized cost of energy. And the levelized cost of energy, or LCOE, is effectively what the developer offers as their strike price to a buyer. So through competition, the benefits of that ITC are largely going to be passed on, frankly, to buyers. So buyers will get a lower strike price, allowing them to be even more interested and enthusiastic about entering these types of contracts, which will drive more demand, which is, of course, beneficial to the developers who will get more buyers and therefore be able to pursue more projects. So I think that in the Alberta context, every province is going to be different in terms of how the ITC kind of works through their decision-making processes. In a Crown Corp system like Saskatchewan, I think it'll help the Crown Corp to see the benefits of renewable energy by having reduced costs. But in Alberta, it'll be just like being able to reduce that strike price and attract more buyers to this market is how I see it happening. And that's really important in a moment where we're all navigating supply chain challenges as well as inflation challenges. And so this will help to counterbalance those effects, I think.
Yeah, hopefully a nice win-win for both sides. Well, thanks, Ben. I really appreciate your time and your overall research in this paper, as well as the broader team at Pembina. I also wanted to make sure we thanked Clayton and Jan. I know Jan was quite busy in the question and answer typing answers, so I'm sure everyone appreciates her expertise for those questions. And thanks to everyone who joined today. We really hope that this presentation, in combination with the paper, can advance some of the education and capacity building barriers, and we hope to see some fruition from this work. So thank you, everyone, for attending today.